you to be aware that we have a continuing set of speakers coming up, and invite you to keep your eyes open for those emails, and hopefully we'll continue to have these Friday meetings. Sometimes they'll be at this time at 11:15, others are earlier at 10. And with that, Dr. Lauren Kogan.
Thank you for that introduction, Patrick. So I realize that title is a bit of a mouthful. Today I'm going to talk about a project that I finished up last semester over my sabbatical, about a participatory evaluation of a transitional housing facility for survivors of intimate partner violence. And so before I kind of dive into that, I want to take a step back and talk about what I mean by a participatory evaluation and how that relates to the work that I do, and also what a transitional housing facility is. So when I say participatory evaluation, I do a lot of, as Patrick said, I do evaluations of organizations that do social change work. My area is looking at the role of media and communication in creating positive social change among marginalized groups. So one thing that I like to do is work with organizations that are on the ground doing interventions and doing evaluations of their work, because it's a way to see what works on the ground or what doesn't work, and try to use that to build theory about how to create positive social change. And then at the same time, I can use my knowledge and what I've learned and help apply that to the organization. So for instance, at the end of an evaluation, I can offer suggestions based on the research for how to tweak the intervention to make it more successful moving forward. Now, of course, that means I end up doing twice the amount of work because I have to write an evaluation report for the organization where I'm sort of wearing a different kind of a hat. And then I use that information in my academic work to write up sort of more academic papers, trying to use what we've learned to build theory. So that's where my interest in evaluations comes in. So what do I mean by a participatory evaluation? Well, it's very similar to the concept of participatory research, which of course doesn't have one singular definition. It can mean kind of a range of things, but at a minimum, it means including the beneficiaries of an intervention in the research to some degree. So some people would just say, in the case of an evaluation, doing interviews with people who took part in the project at the end to say, you know, what did you think? How did it go? What was good about it? What was bad about it? Or in the case of participatory research, it might mean doing interviews with people at the beginning before you design a project to sort of provide input on what might work. Some people would call that participatory research or participatory evaluation. I tend to mean something a little bit more intensive. So there are a lot of phases of evaluation work or of research or of intervention design. And you know, there is the formative research in the beginning, there's developing the design of the evaluation, or in the case of participatory research, designing the intervention, designing the intervention tools, collecting data, analyzing data, writing up the research. So typically an outsider or an academic might have participants come in for small pieces of that pie, typically in the form of interviews, but usually not at the stages of actually designing the project, implementing, analyzing, and writing up. It's a spectrum. So in the case of this project, I had clients of the transitional housing facility help me with the design of the evaluation, including what kinds of research questions I wanted to answer, helping design the evaluation tool, in this case, an interview questionnaire, and I had them help me analyze the data. So I'm going to go through all those stages with you and sort of talk about how that process went, because participatory research and participatory evaluations can be challenging, and I found this to be particularly challenging. I've done participatory work in the past, but I would say that this project is the farthest I've ever gone in terms of incorporating participants, and particularly in the analysis of the data. So I want to talk about the stages of how that went, and I want to be really honest about the challenges that I had, because I think it's really important for people who are interested in doing this kind of work and to help us learn. But I also want to highlight how amazing it was, and the findings that I would not have had, I would not have been able to access had I not been able to have their voices there to help me in the analysis. Okay. And I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions at the end of this. So if anybody, has a burning question partway through, something that I'm explaining that is not clear, feel free to jump in. Okay, so that's my spiel about participatory evaluation. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what a transitional housing facility is, in this case at least. So I worked with an organization in this region that runs a transitional housing facility for survivors of domestic violence. And specifically, it focuses on women with children. So these are survivors of intimate partner violence who have fled their homes and become homeless. And they first go into a homeless shelter. The Philadelphia region has a network for placing women into the shelter system. Though it's not perfect, I'm not going to talk about that, but there's not enough room. So some of the women who go into the shelter system then get transferred to a transitional housing facility, which is a very small facility. Again, in this case, focused on women with children. And the theory behind a transitional housing facility is that it eases women back into the quote unquote real world. So they're given an apartment, they're given support in terms of job training, therapy, childcare, all kinds of things that can help them kind of regain control over their lives before they are eventually put into subsidized housing, ideally, though some people just end up timing out of the system and have to fend for themselves or go find somewhere else to live at the end of it. But most of them end up finding subsidized housing within the region. And they tend to stay in this facility for anywhere between 6 months to a year and a half. So it's a slow process where they're trying to sort of empower them and make them feel like they're ready to take on their lives again. And as I said, in this particular case, it's all women with children. Okay, so now I've explained participatory evaluation, and I've explained this transitional housing facility. So now I want to talk a little bit about the method that I used for this analysis. And before I do that, I also want to just explain why participatory evaluation is useful and why I chose to do it here. So in general, we can talk about participatory evaluation and participatory research being good for two key reasons. One, it can provide more legitimacy to the research, to the evaluation. The people who are going through these interventions are clearly the experts on the interventions, right? They are living it. They have an intimate knowledge of these programs, of what is actually needed to create social change that is sustainable in a way that we as outsiders, as researchers, can't usually access. So in that way, when they're involved in project design, projects might end up being more effective because they were designed with experts who knew what was actually needed. In the case of an evaluation, it might be that the findings are more legitimate, are more useful for tweaking projects going forward because the people who have the most expertise in the topic are there providing input and helping explain the findings. Secondly, they are often considered to be more ethical because you are giving the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries of the research, the beneficiaries of the project, a voice. If you are collecting data, in many ways, the data belong to them. They should understand how to use it and understand what's going to be done with it. They should be the ones having a voice about what kind of research should be done in the first place. In many cases, it's about transferring skills. So for example, perhaps transferring research skills so that the people that you're working with might then be able to actually use those skills to go off and find other ways to create change in their community, or maybe even use them to get a job in the future. So these are all reasons why participatory research and participatory evaluation can be considered valuable. In this case, though I certainly value the importance of spreading skills, and I talked a lot in my workshops about sort of what research is and sort of what designing this research is. There was a lot of teaching. The primary reason I chose to do a participatory evaluation was the idea of the co-creation of knowledge, that they have expertise that I don't have. I am not an expert in intimate partner violence. I have not experienced intimate partner violence. At the same time, most of the women in this region who experience intimate partner violence are women of color, so they are facing a host of challenges that I also cannot access. And so I could not have done this without their expertise. And I'm going to talk at the end of the presentation about some of the findings that I would not have, even though I had a very good design, I think, and I analyzed a lot of transcripts and interviews, I would not have been able to pull some of the conclusions that I was able to if I didn't have this group that helped me with the analysis. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. So let me walk through what this process looked like. So at the beginning of the project, I met with two different groups. I met with the staff of the organization that ran the transitional housing facility, because I wanted to get their input as well on what sorts of research questions they felt needed to be answered in order to help the organization move forward. And then I met with a group of clients. Women who were either current clients of the transitional housing facility or past clients. And we did a workshop wherein I talked to them about what evaluation research looked like, about defining research questions, about doing interviews. And then after that, had them help me think about how to design this project. So for instance, asking them, you know, if we want to make this program more successful, if we want to learn from it about how to prevent this kind of violence in the future, or how to help women who've been through this experience, what kinds of questions should we be answering in the evaluation? And so some of those questions, you know, would probably be obvious, like how are women doing 6 months down the line after they leave, 12 months down the line after they leave? But some questions are less obvious. So for example, during this workshop, in having this discussion with the women, it came up that they thought that one really important question to evaluate was whether therapy should be a required part of a stay at the transitional housing facility. And I can, if there's time later, I can go into why they thought that was such an important question to ask. But it ended up becoming a key piece of the evaluation and a key piece of the analysis and findings. So that's just an example of something, of a way that the project benefited from having them help me design the research. Okay, so then I developed, or we sort of talked about a questionnaire and what kinds of questions would be on there, and even helped me with sort of phrasing to make sure that the questions I was asking were framed and phrased in a way that would get across the point I wanted and get the information that we wanted. So then, and I'll just say that I also had a lot of quantitative data from the organization. So that was not really a part of this research that I'm going to talk about today. I'll reference it a little bit, but there's quantitative data that the organization has collected over the years that was just kind of dumped to me to be able to corroborate or supplement the more qualitative data that I was taking on here. So we came up with an interview questionnaire. I will say that they helped me with it, but I'm the one that finalized it. So this was not a fully participatory process. I also conducted the interviews myself. I chose to do that. So I went and I had individual interviews with women that had been through this program, including the ones that were helping me design it. So I went out and I did these interviews. I had them transcribed, and I then did my best to analyze them myself. I read them over many times before I brought them to the group. I wanted to understand what I could get out of them and how I understood them before I went to the group, for many reasons, but in part because I wanted to be able to compare what was I missing? What did they provide, if anything, that I didn't get on my own from the interviews. So I want to talk, I'm gonna come back to the analysis portion of it, but I want to focus here on the two big challenges that I faced in doing this. Because this is the focus of the talk that I want to have today, the challenges of doing participatory work. So I'm going to talk about two things: participation and privacy. So the first challenge was participation, finding women to help me do this. So I'll be honest, I didn't think I was going to have trouble with participation. This was an evaluation where I was asking these women to use their voices and tell me what they thought about the program, and have a chance to impact the program going forward, and they were getting paid to do it. And when I spoke to women at the beginning of this and sort of presented the project to them, most of them were really excited about it. They sounded enthusiastic, they sounded interested in it. And I knew that participation was a challenge already. So I purposefully asked more women than I thought would be ideal to join in this evaluation process. I invited 10 women to be a part of the process, when in an ideal world, maybe I would want somewhere between 5 and 7. In the end, 4 women worked with me on this. And so, you know, this was a challenge because it was more attrition than I had expected. And it's important to recognize that this is a group that is facing everyday challenges from a whole host of corners that I, cannot understand. So some of the women ended up having to drop out because of health-related reasons related to them or their children, or family emergencies. Some of the women just decided that they couldn't emotionally handle the research. It was re-traumatizing for them to go through these transcripts. And some of the women dropped out and never told me why, and didn't respond to my attempts to reach out to them. And so it's important to recognize how important trauma is and what a hurdle it can be in doing this kind of research. And in fact, one of the papers I'm writing now is specifically about trauma, and the importance of sort of recognizing and dealing with trauma before we can think about doing these more kinds of community-based social change initiatives and efforts. So that's the first challenge, participation. And in the end, it was fine. I mean, this group of 4 women, they were amazing, and we had an amazing experience together. Yes, ideally, I would have liked a couple more, but it was great. So I don't want to downplay that or suggest that the project failed in any way because of that. The second challenge that I want to talk about is privacy. And I'm going to speed through this a little bit so that we have time for questions. This is a really sensitive subject matter. These women were giving me intimate details about their past history of violence and their sort of experiences of trauma and healing. And we were reading the transcripts in a group together in a room. And the transcripts included the women who were sitting in the room with me. And so I had to figure out a way to do this such that their identities wouldn't be revealed, and so that they felt comfortable. Also, you know, the transitional housing facility is quite small. So I didn't know going in, but I thought there was a likelihood that the women in the room even, you know, knew each other outside of this experience. And so that they might be able to identify who was in there. So the way that I dealt with this was when I read the transcripts, I took them apart. I ended up taking excerpts of the interviews, and I took excerpts that related to 3 specific research questions that I decided that I wanted this analysis group to help me with. And so by kind of deconstructing those interviews, and I took out, of course, any kind of identifying information, including information about how many kids they had and the genders of their children. But by taking out these excerpts in that way and organizing it that way instead of by interview, it felt more disconnected, and it didn't seem like anybody could be identified. And we debriefed at the end of the analysis, and everyone felt very comfortable, even reading their own transcripts. Nobody seemed to have a problem reading their own transcripts or reading other people's transcripts. The room felt very comfortable. And so that was something that I had gone in being honestly almost terrified about, that somebody would, in the middle of this experience, suddenly feel very violated or uncomfortable. So that was a major concern of mine going in, and the way that I dealt with it seemed to work and be successful. And I can talk a little bit more about the findings, and specifically what the findings were that that they really added that I wouldn't have gotten on my own, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I want to try to wrap it up here in case there are questions. And I just want to finish off by saying how powerful of an experience it was. And the women in the room at the end of it were really excited to be a part of this. And so that made me feel good as well. They had said they wished that it were a couple days more of analysis. It was, you know, almost therapeutic to sort of talk about this stuff and feel empowered and have a voice, to be able to talk about what they thought the program could do better, and in general, what the world can do better to support women who are going through these experiences. So I'm going to finish it up there. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Let's open it up for any questions. Don't forget, if you want to ask a question, you can unmute, but when you're done, please mute again, since there's a lot of folks in the room.
I saw a hand. Andreas?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kogan. I'd have a question about the diversity of the group that you evaluated in terms of ethnicity. You said it is a facility in Philadelphia, right?
In the region. In
the region, okay. Are you willing to talk about the diversity of the panel that you evaluated?
Yes, I'm willing to talk about the diversity of the field overall in the region, which was heavily reflected in the room that I had. And I will say that most survivors of intimate partner violence in this region are Black.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I just wanted to know if that was also reflected in your research. Thank you very much.
Sure. Dr. Fink?
Hi. I came in about 3 minutes late, so I probably missed the heart of it. Um, could you comment? Maybe you said this, and if you said it, you don't have to repeat it. But when did you do it, and were you face to face with them, or was all on Zoom, or that kind of information? Just the structure of it.
Yeah. So I said I wrote up a report for the organization. I submitted that report to them I was just looking at my emails on March 10th. So I managed to finish up this evaluation before COVID hit. It was unfortunate that I wasn't able to really talk to the organization much after that. We've only recently been back in touch because as many of you probably know, intimate partner violence skyrocketed during the pandemic. And so this organization was quite overwhelmed. So I was fortunate in that I was able to complete this research. These analysis workshops happened in early February. Christina? I'm sorry, it's like hard for me to scan all the boxes.
Thank you. I was curious if you could explain more about the woman's choice or like decision to focus more on if therapy should be mandatory or optional.
Sure. So I'll say, so part of the benefit of doing these evaluations, in my point of view, as I said, is to help these organizations improve down the line, including incorporating better sort of methods and data collection techniques. And so the one thing about this facility is that I observed was that they didn't really have a very solid theory of change. So they believed that psychological healing was really important to have these women be successful in life down the line. But there's also a model here that is similar to many programs of this type around the country, which is that you don't force women to do anything. So you say psychological healing is important, but you don't force them to do therapy, because then you are just repeating these elements of control when you're telling them exactly what they have to do, that they're trying to free themselves from, that they've been a victim of for so long. So there is a full-time therapist on the premise that these women have access to. Hardly anybody goes to therapy. Very few women actually go see the therapist. The ones that do go find it to be incredibly helpful. And so the women in the group, not all of whom went to see the therapist, wanted to know whether it should be mandatory to at least have one session with the therapist, because they recognized how important the psychological healing is. So is there a way to kind of make something mandatory to nudge them in that direction? And so one of the things I found from the interviews was all these sort of preconceived notions among the women of what therapy was and was not, and why they were fearful of going to therapy. And so I was able to sort of use that information to say, maybe we can tweak the program in a way that would make the women more comfortable going to therapy, recognizing how important it is. Regina?
Yeah, hi. So I had a question. I know you kind of briefly touched on this. Well, not briefly. You really emphasized the aspect of your research in kind of trust building and making sure that the participants didn't feel uncomfortable, or like their anonymity was at risk or anything. So I just kind of had and this might be a little bit redundant, but I was just curious how, for you personally, if it was kind of, or like how long it kind of took to maybe build that trust with research, because I think that's a really interesting side of that when you're going to these people and they're really sensitive topics. And honestly, I don't really think about that. So you bring that up was really interesting, how when you're in that position, you have to approach with a lot of empathy and everything. So I was just curious if you don't mind sharing if that was difficult to build that trust and everything, because obviously that's a really important component of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's something I was also really worried about, because obviously you're not going to have a really good discussion, dynamic discussion, if everybody's feeling kind of guarded. And I'll talk about the ways that I dealt with this. For one, before I even started my interviews, I took a 2-week workshop on working with survivors of domestic violence, so that I would understand the dynamic and the context a bit better. All of the women that I interviewed were referred to me through their case managers. And basically a case manager is like a best friend in these contexts. So these women are super close with their case managers. They function much like therapists, actually. And so they already had this really pre-established, very trusting relationship with their case managers, who passed them on to me. So I think that helped a bit, that I was being referred to by somebody that they trusted. I had also interviewed these women. So all of them, I had spent a large amount of time talking to them about their experiences before the analysis workshop. And so, obviously that's going to make us feel a little bit more close. But then, the follow-up question to that is, well, how did they feel comfortable in that interview? And I would say that one of the ways I gained trust was just doing a lot of listening. So a lot of sitting back, asking them to tell me more, to sort of let them guide the conversation as much as possible, and to constantly just repeat and make it clear that I want to hear their point of view, that this is not about me gaining X, Y, and Z information. I want to hear what they have to say, what their thoughts and opinions are. And the same in the analysis workshop. I mean, I repeated many, many times, maybe too many times, that I needed them because they were the experts and not me, that I was the expert, in the room, perhaps in sort of methodology and research and analysis techniques, but that they were the experts in intimate partner violence. And I think sort of having them realize that they were really the ones with the authority there helped them loosen up a bit. And they wanted to talk. This was not something that they were doing just because they felt like they had to. I mean, they had a lot to say. So once we got started, I mean, it just went. So it was fine, and it was good.
Thank you.
Sure. Christina.
Thank you. So I have a bit of a meta question. It's librarian-y. So you've talked about how you collected a lot of data. You had the transcripts, you had the deconstructed ones. You also had access to quantitative data. Are you comfortable sharing kind of like how you organized, kept track, kind of like made sense of all that stuff, both for you and, like the kind of data you were sharing then with your participants?
Yeah. Well, one answer to that is really logistical, because the data they gave me were like sort of a mess. I mean, it was from 17 different surveys that they collected in 20 different formats over 15 years. It was a nightmare. I had a graduate student that helped me organize some of it in the beginning. And then in the end, I mean, the major way that I dealt with it was just focusing it around the particular research questions I had, so that I could kind of ignore the data that did not relate to those questions. And a part of my findings and report really focused on better ways to collect data. In other words, to say, if you want to prove that your program works, that this theory that you have is founded, you need to collect better data to prove that point and provide evidence. And the way it's set up now is flawed in some serious ways, which they know. I mean, they face the problem of every NGO, which is that they have way too few dollars for the things that they need to do. And in their minds, like many others, it's like monitoring and evaluation. It's like, oh, I don't want to spend my money on that. We need to be spending our money on these other things that are more important. And so I'm of course the academic coming in and talking about the importance of evidence and data and for policy for policy influence, etc. But yeah, my interviews were much easier to organize than the quantitative data. I used in vivo. No, Atlas, I'm sorry. Oh, my brain is melting. I used Atlas for the transcript analysis. David?
Hi, I'm struck by, just a quick comment, I'm struck by how much sensitivity and care you brought to this topic. And I think you've given us all a great lesson in how to address a topic like this with care and humanity. Shifting gears just a moment, I was wondering how this study alters your understanding of your field, and will this change the way people look at things in your field kind of more broadly?
I hope so. So I'll answer that question. Maybe this isn't the best way to answer it, but I'll answer it by sort of two papers that I'm currently working on that are sort of coming out of this that I'm hoping will further the field. And one is basically the talk that I just gave, sort of about the value of participatory evaluation. I mean, I'm certainly not the first person to do a participatory evaluation, but it's not done to the extent that I believe it ought to be. And as I said, a lot of people will just do sort of interviews at the end of a program and call that a participatory evaluation. The one paper is about the value of doing this. And again, as I said, the findings that I wouldn't have had that reflect on real policy debates that are happening right now. Like within the Department of Housing and Urban Development, we're trying to take money away from transitional housing programs, and sort of the insights that I gained from doing a participatory evaluation that can reflect on those political debates that are happening right now. And then the second, actually there's three, I had to talk about three. Second one is about trauma, and sort of we have this idea in the theory of communication for development and social change, that it's really about empowering communities to take charge of their own social change. And so one thing I want to talk about is the importance in certain communities of addressing trauma before you can get there. That it's really hard to feel empowered to take ownership and change your future when you are experiencing trauma. And then the third sort of big takeaway piece from this is one of the research questions that I had these women help me answer was, what does empowerment mean? It's this word that we use a lot in the field, and it changes kind of from context to context. And so for these women, what does empowerment mean for somebody who's experienced intimate partner violence? And they helped me come up with this list of things that were just eye-opening. And one of them, for an example, is the power of storytelling. So for these women, they couldn't feel healed. They couldn't feel empowered until they were able to tell their story. So psychologically, it's sort of like the idea that if you can articulate what happened to you, it sort of means that experience is in the past. It might still be affecting your present, but if you were able to articulate it as sort of having a beginning and a middle and an end somewhere in your mind, it suggests that you've moved beyond, to a certain degree, moved beyond what happened to you. And so being able to tell your story is really important. And that might not mean telling it to an audience. It might mean writing it down in a journal to yourself. That even that kind of storytelling is really important for healing and crucial for empowerment. So those are kind of 3 bullet point things that I would say I'm hoping I can take from this to further the field. Thanks. Rosie?
So I had a quick clarifying question and then another question from that. I think I blinked and just missed this, but did you say, so the participants in your analysis, that was the 4 women, but the interviews, you did more than 4 interviews. Like you interviewed.
Yes, but it included those 4 women.
Okay. Do you know, I know the timing with giving this report on March 10th and then this influx, but I was struck by what you said that like the data really belongs to the people because you're collecting their data. And I'm curious if you know, like once you gave this report, what the organization either did or plans to do in terms of sharing that with all the interviewees and like kind of the lessons learned. I'm also thinking about this in a very different framework, but in the work that I did, we would do like donor surveys and stuff like that. But something that we were always told was don't survey someone unless you're going to actually like do something after you survey them. And I was curious if that philosophy like came up too with the admin folks.
So as I said, they went a bit off the radar after I submitted the report. We've actually just been in touch in the past couple of weeks. So I'm supposed to do a presentation for them. So thanks for the prep, guys. I'm supposed to do a presentation for them summarizing the project within the next couple of months. And they are hoping to, I don't know, we'll have to talk about where it goes from there, to what extent they actually use the findings, whether it just ends up being something that they give to donors or some version of to donors to say, hey, look, this is a good project, give us more money, which is typically, you know, one of the major reasons why organizations want evaluations in the first place. And then, I don't know if this is answering your question, but every time I do an evaluation like this, it's written into the contract that I can do whatever I want afterward with the data. So I will write academic papers. The extent to which I will, you know, it's a little tricky with interviews. I'm not gonna, you know, publish the interviews or probably even post them in any kind of way. With the last project I did, I tried something experimental where I broke up the interviews like sentence by sentence and gave them to or part of the interview sentence by sentence and gave them to the organization to see like, is this useful in any way? Like, would this be a way that I could safely distribute private data? But it didn't really go anywhere. I think other people are trying to answer this question of how do you take interview transcripts and put them into the public sphere in some way that's useful to other researchers, but I don't really have a good answer for it yet, unfortunately. Ed.
Well, I have a question that indicates how evil I am. So it requires some introduction, and it may be that this question is impossible for you to answer. But nevertheless, as you were presenting this, I was thinking of a few some significant studies of dealing with participants. One of them is, and you may know all these, one of them is Margaret Mead did a study of people, Pacific Islanders, and asked them about essentially how sex is dealt with on their island. And it turns out that subsequently, she wrote a book, she became famous. Subsequently, it turned out that all these people were lying to her, number one. Number two, there's a book by Harold Garfinkel called Studies in Ethnomethodology. And one of the chapters in that book is interacting with and interviewing a person who was wanted to have a sex change operation, and he interviewed this person many times, and then the person had a sex change operation, and it turned out that everything the person told him was false. It was only so that he would be eligible. I don't remember if he or she would be eligible to have a sex change operation. And the third story is, and I can't remember the woman's first name, Irving Goffman, you may have heard of, but Irving Goffman's daughter wrote a book, and it resulted as a professor, and it resulted in her getting promoted and getting awards and all this. And then a bunch of people, several people, went through the data that she gathered, which was by interviewing people who were essentially members of gangs. And it turns out that they were inconsistent with a given individual is inconsistent, it turns out that it seems from the critics that they were lying. And the final example is Robert Caro has a new book out called Working, which talks about how we gathered data, especially about Lyndon Johnson and about Robert Moses in New York. And it turns out that in the Lyndon Johnson case, for years, the community where Lyndon Johnson was, where he won his first election, indicated how he legitimately won the first election. So Caro and his wife moved to that town in Texas and were there for 2 years. And after 2 years, they found out that was all a lie, that in fact, election ballots were stolen and all this stuff. Mm-hmm. So the summary of all of these 4 stories is not a happy one, because it indicates that participants are not necessarily telling the truth and not necessarily lying, even so that they would gain something from the lie. And I don't know if there's a way, I don't have an idea about how to handle it. And I'm wondering if you thought about this, or you have any suggestions or any views about this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a great response. I can say a couple of things. You know, one, which I'm sure is the same as all of those researchers, you know, in my gut, things felt like they were being honest, but at the same time, people said different things. So there was some conflict in what people were saying, and some were even conflicts in fact. So there were certain things that perhaps people, they might not have been lying about it, but they might have sort of a different memory of things. Some of the things, like sort of the bigger takeaways, some of the bigger takeaways were corroborated by the quantitative data. So those I felt a little bit more confident about. Like, for example, they talked about sort of what, do I have enough time to sort of give a little context here? So I'll give like 2 seconds of context. One of this big debate that's happening right now around transitional housing is whether transitional housing provides any benefits over rapid rehousing. So rapid rehousing works on the theory that people who are homeless need a house, they need a home, and they can't recover from trauma, they can't move forward in their life without feeling like they have a home. And so the idea is that you get them into housing as quickly as possible and you subsidize it. So that they can sort of have a stable base from which to then go do other things, get a job, reintegrate, et cetera, et cetera. The transitional housing facility has a very different philosophy, which is that they need to be they're technically homeless in this transitional housing facility. It's a shelter. So the idea is that they stay in this shelter and they sort of recover from trauma there, they get job training skills, and then they can go and be in a house. And HUD is pushing heavily for rapid rehousing. It's cheaper. And so these women now are getting pushed out of the transitional housing facility a lot faster than they were a couple of years ago. And so one of the findings from this research was the women trying to explain why the transitional housing facility was really important for them and what it provided in terms of healing from trauma. And the quantitative data backed that up. So comparing the women who had gone into the transitional housing facility versus the rapid rehousing facility, their assessments of how at risk they felt in terms of experiencing violence were much higher in the rapid rehousing group than in the transitional housing group. So the information they were giving me about why they felt safer at the transitional housing facility compared to the rapid rehousing facility made perfect sense. I mean, it was like about the fact that there were gates and cameras and their abusers couldn't get to them, which they wouldn't have in a rapid rehousing situation. So, you know, in that instance, their honesty made complete sense, both logically and when compared with the quantitative data. There might have been other parts of this that perhaps there might have been some dishonesty, or not dishonesty, but maybe just some kind of misunderstanding or inconsistencies that maybe I can't answer as well. But I can at least say that some of the big takeaways I was able to kind of triangulate in different ways. That was a really long response to that, I'm sorry. Michelle?
Hi, thank you for your talk. Also, I wanted to ask you about how you framed it. So did you use a research theory, and when you were talking about triangulating the data, what were your methods? I'm just curious what your actual methods were.
So again, I'm not sure that this is going to answer your question, but I basically structured the whole thing around a few research questions, which were developed by input from both the staff and the clients. And so my methods reflected that. And so I had made a decision just to do interviews. And so it was the interview questions that were designed to help answer the research questions that I was looking at.
So you didn't, okay, yeah. It wasn't like theory based or any kind of.
So, I mean, I'm going to answer that in two ways. I'm going to talk about sort of theory and theories of change, which
okay.
use different ways here. And we're talking about a lot in our class this semester.
Okay.
So in terms of a theory of change, like in some ways I wanted to test the organization's theory of change. And this idea, in part, that by allowing women to create their own intervention, essentially. So you have these women in these facilities, you offer them 20 different potential methods of support, from yoga classes to therapy, to childcare, to job training, to cooking skills, to cleaning skills. I mean, they have all these different ways that they're supported there, and they get to kind of pick and choose what they think will help them move forward, as opposed to saying, you need to get a job. That should be your focus, which is what some people believe, like you need to get your finances in order, and that's the thing that really matters. So they get to kind of pick their own intervention. And so part of it was about assessing their theory of change, about how to support these women and how to empower them. And so I wanted to test that. And so some of it was centered around that theory of change. And then in terms of theory, I would say that one of the major sort of things that I wanted to look at was this idea of empowerment, you know, or kind of the Paulo Freire idea of how do you get somebody from kind of self-realization of their own oppression to community change to national change, and sort of this idea of how do you promote empowerment among this particular group, meaning IPV survivors. So that's maybe how I would sort of think about it in terms of theory from my own field, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
Well, and then I have one more question, like the quantitative part of it, like what did you do with that? How did you calculate?
I basically used it to support what I was finding in the qualitative data. So if the findings that I had, to the extent I could, I backed them up or compared them to the quantitative data. And in some cases, the quantitative data, despite me having so much data, it was not the data that I needed to answer the questions that I wanted to answer. And so one major way I used the data was to show them you don't have enough data to answer these kinds of questions.
Or you don't have the right data. Like maybe they need to be asking different questions, kind of. Yeah.
Or yes, both.
Mm-hmm.
Getting more of the data that they have and getting different data. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren, if I can jump in there, it's this kind of, I guess, dovetails on what you just addressed with Michelle, but also going back to David Mindich's question. Your foregrounding of the question of empowerment is really fascinating, particularly in terms of evaluation. But I wonder to what extent you felt that through this research and through this evaluation, you also discovered limitations to the participatory approach. And since, and this goes to Michelle's question, because there's such a vast body of literature on that within communication for development social change, just as, you know, you're coming and now you still have to go and deliver back to the community itself again. How does that sort of crop up in this research, and what did you learn from it?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure if I have a good way to answer it at this point. The limitations of participation.
Or maybe ask you a different way, what frustrated you that you wish you maybe were able to do in ways that maybe drew from the richness of the experience, but yet you didn't feel that you necessarily were?
Yeah, I mean, one of those things, you know, as I said, like one piece of advice I would give to people who are doing this is to recruit a lot more people than you think you need. As I said, I would have liked to have had more voices, and what I do want to think more about is how I could have gotten more people involved. So you know, as I said, they were facing challenges that I couldn't understand, but I would like to sort of dig into that a little bit more and try to figure out better ways to get participants who have experienced trauma or facing other kinds of challenges to be able to hear their voices and have them involved, because I failed at that piece of it. I mean, really, I didn't get the voices, as many voices as I had wanted, either in the interviews or in the analysis. And so one thing that I need to think about moving forward is how to do that better.
It was an exceptionally challenging area of research too, so I'm sure that, you know, if had it been a different topic, you maybe would have had more participation. So we've got a couple more minutes. Any final questions?
David?
I've worked a little bit with nonprofits over the course of my life, and everyone always seems, I mean, we're all busy, but nonprofits seem particularly busy. Is that a challenge? Just, I mean, as you said, like when you go back to the organization, they're really not doing as much with it as you thought they might. I mean, is that also just an issue of just the time crunch that organizations like this undergo or live with?
So I mean, yeah, I mean, and I'm sure you know this, but these organizations, they just don't have enough money ever. They're constantly facing turnover because the jobs are so demanding and so stressful. I mean, especially in an area like this, you're working with victims of intimate partner violence. It's emotionally draining. Their rate of turnover at this organization is incredibly high because they are asking so much of the people that work there and paying them so little. And so, you know, their efforts, their mental efforts go towards, you know, keeping the organization running and helping the women or the beneficiaries. And they have very little sort of mental space for evaluations, and they care about them, you know, 80 to 90% because they need them to get more money. And so, you know, it's sometimes it feels like pulling teeth to get them to engage with sort of the idea of using theory or building theory or doing things that sort of might be more difficult for the purpose of building the national evidence base. So that it can influence policy more. So I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in the case of this organization. As I said, the part of the reason they've been less responsive is because IPV has skyrocketed since the pandemic started. So now that I'm back in touch with them and I'm going to be presenting to them, and they seem very open to it. I mean, they're not shying away. They're excited to talk about it. So I'm being optimistic at this point, and we'll see. Should we wrap up there, Patrick? Oh, I'm sorry. There are a couple of other hands. I don't know if we have a couple more minutes or not. Tom?
Yeah, hi everybody. I just wanted to follow up on a methodological note that from what Ed was talking about in terms of either deception or in participant observation research and other problems of data quality. And simply to point out kind of the obvious, but that's a problem in all research, right? Not just participant observation research. And so problems ranging from response bias of the simple sort to survey questions to outright more complicated things, such as the problem that pollers are presented with recently on people not wanting to admit that they will vote for Trump, and then even more recently, people who used to vote for Trump not wanting to admit to themselves and amongst their friends that they will vote for Biden. So there's always problems of representation in data, and I thought the way that you at least tried to triangulate with the data that you had, it's the response you have, and you do what you can, and it seemed like it should have been helpful. So that was a good example. Thank you for explaining that.
Oh, great. Thank you, Tom.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of you for your participation and for sticking around. This is a great second entry into our speaker series. I'm really happy that Zoom seems to be a way in which people find this accessible. Lauren, thank you so much for your presentation and giving us a sense of the dedication that you put into your work, and just a really powerful representation also, I think, of communication for development social change research that is, has a global profile, but here's a case where we see how you're working with it very local, and so thanks for sharing that today. Folks, thanks again for coming, and hope to see you next week.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming by.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.